I'm Kier from In Defense Of, a podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the one you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1...
Hello and welcome to episode 96 of Better Podcasting. On today's show, we help you look 5 years into the future for your show.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we're going to talk about crowdsourcing media hosts.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we run down a ton of great listener feedback.
Lauren, kick off the show now.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your hosts for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Hello and welcome to episode number 96 of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is Stargate Pioneer.
We're back. We're better than last week, and that's better than the week before. That's because every single week, Steven and I sit down, we critique our show, we figure out what works, what doesn't, and we make it better for you, our listener, because we are here to give you tips and tricks for hobby podcasters to make your show better. Steven, it's so good to see you. It's so good to see you back in a hotel room, or is that women's prison somewhere?
It's prison every day of my life because I am in a podcast with you.
Which you decided to do, by the way. And I tried to fire you, and you still came back.
Well, you know, it's that whole, what is it? You're in love with your serial killer. Isn't that a thing? That's a condition. What's the name of that?
Stockholm Syndrome?
No, Stargate Pioneer Syndrome. But we are here today with another edition of Better Podcasting. And as P said, we're going to make your show better. And by us, we mean you, because we're all about the group learning. And that's one of the things that we like to solicit here is different questions. We want to know, how have you saved your podcast? That's one of the questions we always ask, because if you have done something to be a hero, to be a true nationality hero, you want to share that with the rest of the world. Tell everybody, how have you saved your podcast? You can send that to us through any of the ways that you can reach us. Facebook.com/betterpodcasting, Twitter.com/betterpod, or just email podcast@betterpodcasting.com and tell us, how have you saved your podcast? While you're doing that, why don't you tell us, what is a hobby podcaster to you? What is the definition of a hobby podcaster? We've been a while since we've talked about that, and we want to know, what is a hobby podcaster mean to you? Right, SP?
Yeah, I want to know. I really want to know. What does a hobby podcaster mean to you? Do you consider yourself a hobby podcaster? Do you consider yourself an amateur? Do you consider yourself an enthusiast? Are you an independent? Are you a procaster? What do you call yourself and why? But especially, do you call yourself a hobby podcaster? And even if you don't, what do you consider a hobby podcaster to be? I want to know. So get your information to us.
Let's go ahead, though, and roll in to our topic.
Today, we have a great topic, and let's get back to the fact that Better Podcasting is created, it's produced, and it's published as an example of what is possible with a hobby podcast. And also, to be quite honest with you, Stephen and I have an excuse to buy various pieces of podcast gear to check out and improve our show through this show. So all our other shows benefit from Better Pod. But most importantly, Better Podcasting is giving you, our listener, tips and tricks on how to make your show better. And today, I'm going to throw out the scenario. Imagine it's 2022. Now, today it's 2017, but imagine it's 2022. So 2022. Cars are equipped with podcast players and they're flying all over the planet. Yes, we have flying cars. We have jogging suits that are made to run for you when you get too tired and play inspirational podcasts from a player embedded in the hoodie string. Oops. Better not lose that one in the washing machine. And finally, in 2022, there is a Canadian-owned podcast hosting company.
Why do you have to make me suddenly fall out of your magical world that you painted for me? And everybody was with you until the moment you said there would be a Canadian podcast host. Now nobody believes that we're talking about 2022 anymore, and now they know you made this all up.
That's because Canada won't be around in 2022, right?
Oh, that's true, actually. Yeah. We're going to be annexed by Stargate Pioneer Land. But yes, I imagine it is the year 2022. There is an important question that you haven't thought about amongst all of this sea of questions and cool tech that you're now visioning. Is your little podcast still around? And that question's going to lead you to ask some other questions. Do you still want it to exist in 2022? That's okay if you don't. But 5 years is a great number to look at when you are planning your podcast because it's not that far and it doesn't take long before you have a 5-year-old child who is about to start kindergarten.
From birth to kindergarten while podcasting. Yes, it happens to all of us. So let's take a look at what's happened over 5 years for any show. Have you gotten better at recording or editing? Have you added gear? Have you taken bad gear away? Did you add a co-host? Did you drop a co-host? Are you planning on making money today? And do you think that's going to be realistic in 2022? How many downloads within the first 6 weeks would you like to have? Basically, what we're getting at is where do you want your show to be in 5 years? And guess what, Steven?
What?
That podcast that we're envisioning in 2022 starts to happen now, not 4.5 years from now. Jeez.
Well, that's not true. What if I wanted a podcast that was half a year of actual podcasting, but 4.5 years worth of material? Then I would start it in 4.5 years.
You would, but either you've stacked up content to the point where you're not getting any feedback for 4.5 years, or you're throwing the content out there so quickly that I'm not sure anybody's really going to stick with you. I don't know, one of the two. Anyway, we're going to talk about considerations you need to make with your show today that will affect you in September of 2022. So first, let's start with the basics. We already talked about this last week on episode 95, so we're not going to hit it too hard, but we did want to reiterate it. Podcast hosting. If you don't care about your show in 5 years, whatever, just pull the show down and just never look back. It's going to be gone forever. We've actually had podcasts on the Gonna Geek Network that have done that, and they just aren't available for mass download anymore. So that's okay. If you self-host, keep updating your website. Make sure that you still pay your hosting bill. If you go with a podcast company, a media hosting company, go with somebody who will be on sound financial footing and has a track record, by the way, of staying on the leading edge of updating their service. Podbean, for example, has proven that is an example of that recently. And as I mentioned last week, a secondary consideration would be if you end your show and you're not uploading any more new shows, so you don't need a monthly data quotient, do you still want to pay the same $20, $25, whatever it is a month, $15 a month? No, at Libsyn, you can throttle back to $5 a month. So that is all good. So just remember those issues 5 years from now. Where do you want your podcast to be? And make those decisions with your podcast media host today. So what about, Steven, if your show gets big and what do you do about that in 5 years?
Well, it's a valid concern when you're looking at the 5-year mark. You don't know. 5 years is a long time. And while you may say, I want my show to be out there in 5 years, and I'm just a little show now, what if you'd get all of a sudden a bunch of people coming your way? Well, you got to be able to support that. So you want a future plan. And when you're picking a host now or a provider now, you want to make sure that you're preparing for that possible traffic. That might not mean that you are on something like Podbean right now that can handle it, but you might want to make sure you're with somebody who you could transfer over there and redirect really easily if that was the case. Or you just start off with someone now who you know is going to be able to handle that. But you just got to think of that. Think of the future when you start now, because as SP said, the future is now. Now, Uncle SP, I have a question for you.
Yes.
What about if I don't care where the show is hosted and I'm just having fun?
If that's the case, first of all, remember to have fun. But second of all, I would go with a media host, even a cheap media host, that if it has an RSS feed generator with it, you can plug in a 301 redirect. So you can easily change where your media is hosted later on. So make sure that wherever you host, you can put a 301 redirect. Otherwise, the people that are subscribed to your show, say your show gets unexpectedly big for whatever reason, and you didn't mean it to, but it is, then all of a sudden you have to take care of it like a real show if you want to keep on doing it. So a 301 redirect is very important no matter where you host. And if you don't want to host with one of the recommended companies or self-host, like we recommend here on Better Podcasting, I keep on saying Better Pod because of their Twitter account, Better Podcasting, then just make sure you can redirect. Okay, Auntie Steven. If you self-host, that means you have ultimate control like you do with your shows, right, Steven?
Yeah, absolutely. I have ultimate control, and that means that I don't need to worry about anything else at all ever. No, that's not true, because if you are self-hosting, flip side of that is while you may have control of where that all goes, your web host could go away tomorrow. So while we're talking about the future proofing, the 5-year proofing for your hosting, let's talk quickly about the self-hosting avenue. Back up your damn files, okay? Like, how many times can we say that? Back them up. If you don't back them up and your host goes away tomorrow, you are SOL. So make sure you back them up so that you can extract that data and move it to where it needs to go if you are a self-hoster. And it's just a good reminder while you're thinking about your 5-year plan, because as we all know, Stargate Pioneer's house of hosting won't exist tomorrow.
No, it doesn't even exist today. So let's just forget about that. But let's move on besides the RSS feed and the hosting, and let's look into other ways to improve your show. So you're trying to improve your show. You're trying to make it a better show in 5 years. You're envisioning what your show is like in 5 years, and you want to make it closer to what you're envisioning to what it really is. One way you can do that is just sign up for the podcastforum.com and ask other podcasters, a lot of great hobby podcasters with a lot of knowledge there, to review your show, ask them questions about what they would do in different situations. So remember, you can find that at thepodcastforum.com. Another way that you can do it, by the way, is listen back to your show. Listen back to it 2 weeks later. Listen back to it 2 months later, even 2 years later. Critique yourself, critique your co-hosts if you have them. Have production meetings with your co-hosts or with yourself if it's just you, or if you're lucky enough to have a mentor, bring him in and have a production meeting and go over what you learned in the editing bay or by listening back, or both. And another great way, which I want to do this, is to group listen to your own shows and hot wash them minute by minute. You know, actually listen to your show, and then everybody would have a word say stop or whatever. So you would stop, and then they would say, okay, this is what I heard there. We need to stop doing that, that sort of thing. That is taking your podcast seriously and looking to better it. No matter if you have verbal crutches, if you've taken sidetracks that shouldn't be in there, if the editing point wasn't in there, like you're listening to an edited show and you're like, I can't believe we left that in there. Whatever it is, make sure you do that. And also improve your audio quality if you need to. We talk about this all the time. Have everybody on their own microphone. and try a dynamic microphone if you don't already have one. If you have a condenser microphone or if you have your phone, try a dynamic microphone. You know, the Knox podcasting microphone is only $40 right now at Amazon. Go get it. If you don't have it, it's a great microphone. Turn off your speakers. I, right now, do not have my speakers on. I just looked over and checked. The speakers are not on. My earphones are on, and that is isolating the sound, so I don't get any of that speaker sound through my microphone. And here's another way that you can improve your podcast. Stay consistent. Not everybody is like Dan Carlin with Hardcore History. In fact, pretty much no one else is like Dan Carlin. Consistency helps build your audience over time. And Dan Carlin is just amazing at what he does to get millions of people downloading his podcast when he only releases 4 to 6 a year. I mean, that man is just incredible.
Another thing while we're talking about looking back and really reflecting is make sure you don't become too short-sighted either, because that's a huge important factor when you're looking at sort of your 5-year plan. It's great to look back 2 months or 2 weeks or anything like that, but don't sell yourself short. If you look back at your previous year, and we talk about that occasionally at the end of the year, if you look back at your year, try to highlight what your biggest accomplishment was of the year and what your biggest ball dropping was of the year, because that's going to set you a game plan that you're going to look at for the next year. So again, if you're looking back at 1 year of podcasting, you've only got 4 left till that 2022 moment. So don't get short-sighted as you're reviewing.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my greatest accomplishment in the past year with better podcasting was firing Steven. The greatest ball drop moment was that Steven came back.
Yeah, that's very true. My biggest accomplishment was that time that I said goodbye to Stargate Pioneer. My biggest ball dropping was that time that I used my time travel machine to go back in time and meet Stargate Pioneer originally.
We haven't met yet in person. Are you talking virtually or in person here? I'm confused. Okay, let's move on. Okay, let's look at organization and record keeping. For example, if your show is not current events based, you might want to create a log or some sort of index to track your topics. So when you're developing new content, you don't double up, or maybe you can go back and reference what you said before. And you can embed that in MP3s in the ID3 tag. You can post the details of the episode, or you could have episode details with episode details.
Absolutely. And I think what SP means by that is when you're actually in, the little section of your blog, of your media host where you're posting the episode, put specifics in there. What have you talked about, so that when people are actually searching the information on Libsyn or Podbean or wherever it is, you've got the episode details there for them to find and maybe entice them to come on in and hopefully become a bigger listener and thus stick with you till 5 years. Now, one of the things while we're talking about that's really important to remember is that you are doing this not only for them, but also for yourself, for the future. If somebody ends up asking you a question when you are out somewhere, let's say you're speaking at an event or something, and you've done that, how are you going to find it unless you've got a way to search it? You're like, oh yeah, you know what? We talked about self-hosting pros and cons. It was somewhere between episodes 50 and 100. Have fun. That's not going to work. So what I could do instead would be like, you know what? We did an episode. I don't know it off the top of my head. Let me look and find it for you. Get back to you and tell you that it's episode number 65. So it's really important to really index this information, because otherwise you double up, like SP said, or you can't reference back to it, or you end up wanting to build off of something or revisit something, and it's really hard to figure out how specific you got. You might want to go and take another angle. Well, you can go back and listen to the first time you talked about it so that you can develop different content.
And don't just promote your episode. Here's what I'm talking about. Don't just put a tweet out or a Facebook post whenever you publish a new episode. Yeah, that's great. Please do that. That's a good thing to do. But don't just do that. Connect with your listeners. Chat with them on social media. You know, wherever you're posting, make sure you're interacting back and forth. And for gosh sakes, go to where they are in real life. This is the way to really connect with listeners. Radio stations do this all the time on the weekends with events. You have ESPN shows. They go from like the college pregame show. They go from college to college here in the United States, and they don't dare set foot in Canada because Canada college football sucks. And I'll
just say Canada football sucks. Okay.
Okay. Good enough. We'll take that as fact now. So go where they are in real life. Like, here's a couple of examples of what we've done on the Gonna Geek Network in the past couple of years. We've gone to Indiana Comic Con. We've gone to Gen Com this year. C2E2 was great in Chicago last year. We have other people on the network like Audibly Exquisite that are going into New York shows. We've got Gallifrey Public Radio that goes to Gallifrey 1 every year. This is going where the people that are going to listen to your show are. So go there, experience life with them. And if you get a chance, tell them about your show. Maybe do a panel there at conventions or something like that. So yeah, you can meet other people this way, and you can create a community this way. And remember, you will burn out if you are not rewarded. I know Steven's like a little puppy. He needs his dog bone every once in a while, his Scooby snack.
That's, I will let you make that because I think that's a solid point. And honestly, rewarding yourself comes from many different ways. And a lot of times, just as a hobbyist, that interaction that you get with people, you build that community and you have at least some people that you can talk to about your subject more passionate about, and you can really just engage with them, is a reward in itself. Or just, for me, watching the community grow is a reward. I talk about that all the time on the GonnaGeek.com community, as I love to see where it's at now. And that's the reward in itself, is seeing all of these wonderful geeks together. So yeah, if as a hobbyist, you need to reward yourself somehow, and building that community is going to give you that.
Even if it's just for fun, if you don't get any financial gain out of it, this is content that you want to cover anyway. So go there, have fun. And if you are trying to build some sort of a business in your area, like if you're an independent podcaster, a convention in your topic is where you want to be to start making those connections. So yeah, I get that. But if you're a hobbyist, and I've talked about this before, going to a podcast convention might not be worth it financially to you, and you might want to put that money into going into something in your genre. So just remember that. All right. Do you still want to have fun in 5 years? I mean, that's something that we want to do here. It's really something you should be doing on any show, because if you're not having fun, regardless of your content, you will burn out. This week to week thing, even if it's a month to month, you're not going to want to continue. So have fun every episode. And don't think that the fun will magically start in 2022 when you get to the frontier. That's a Starfighter reference, by the way. It starts today in your studio, in your hotel room, as Steven is podcasting there, or wherever you're recording. If you sit down and hit record on your podcast, make sure you have fun.
I gotta say, usually I'm pretty on board here with your points, but the question was, do you still want to have fun in 5 years? And that implies that I'm having fun on this podcast right now. I don't get that.
You are having fun in this podcast. Do you know why? Do you know why I know that you're having fun in this podcast? Because you're in your hotel room and you are controlling your podcast Skypeosaurus remotely and being able to record all this and produce all this remotely. That's why I know you're having fun. You cannot believe the technology that's available to you to do this right now. So don't you even dare insinuate you're not having fun. There. Hey, here's another thing. Make sure that your goals for 2022 are realistic. We talked all about setting goals very early on in this podcast, episodes 1 through 6, on how to start your podcast. Don't plan on making unrealistic goals. You're not going to make $2 million when you're podcasting in 2022. If you're Canadian, you might, because that's like $25 American, but you're not going to make $2 million a year American in 2022. Don't even plan on podcasting full time in 5 years. That might be a goal that you want eventually. But I'm telling you, in the space that there is today, in 5 years, you might want to plan to know how to podcast full time and then get there from where you start off in 5 years. It might happen before that, but make sure that's a realistic expectation in 5 years. We went over realistic expectations earlier in this podcast series. So make sure, your average download for a show, 50% of the shows are better, 50% are worse than 203. And this is Libsyn based statistics from July 2017. 203 is your average download. So just make sure that you're setting realistic expectations.
And also remember, life is dynamic. You are a hobby podcaster, and you want to remember life is dynamic and the future is unknown. Not only the future of your podcast, the future of your life. And you may have to change and adapt for that 5-year plan. Heck, in 5 years, we might not even call it podcasting anymore. We might call it soundcasting because we're all going to be on SoundCloud. That could be a thing.
Maybe. Yeah, we really don't know. In 5 years, miracles can happen. Oh, hey, look, there's no magic button to press and you get to success in 5 years. Whatever you define as a success, if you're just podcasting for fun, if it's a hobby, if you're an independent podcaster, even if you're a procaster, you need to work on it every day. And I'm guessing if you're listening to this and you're listening to this far into the episode, you are interested in improving your show. And maybe perhaps you are even thinking about 5 years from now. If you're not, you are now. So keep at it, keep improving, seek out ways to improve. We'll be here for you on Better Podcasting, and so will all the other great Better Podcasting listeners.
I'm not making that commitment because in 5 years, I might have been fired and rehired several more times. So I don't know. I might not be around in 5 years. Just depends on how moody Stargate Pioneer is.
It's actually more than likely. It'll probably happen again, folks. It's just a question of when.
Awesome. So we want to know, how exactly are you planning for 5 years from now? Let us know through any of the ways we mentioned at the top of the show, including just going to betterpodcasting.com and write us there. How are you planning for 5 years from now? Where do you want to be? And it's okay to say, I want to be not podcasting anymore because I'm just doing this right now for X reason. That's okay. Or I want to be on my 20th podcast because I like to do 2 podcasts a year and then end them. That's fine too. We want to know, what are your plans for 2022? Aside from, of course, having your amazing podcasting microphone that is not a dynamic microphone or a condenser microphone. It is the new Stargate Pioneer style microphone. He's working on it.
I am indeed. Just stay tuned. I'm not, but...
All right, let's do the download.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
Sometimes in life, there's a thing called crowdfunding or crowdsourcing or whatever you want to call it. Basically, you know, the Indiegogos, the Kickstarters, all that stuff where you are trying to pool the community to fund your project. And there has been a few podcast projects before, such as Adam Curry's Podcaster Pro, which, as we know, did not get funded. There have been other projects as well, but SP, have we seen a podcast media host yet?
A podcast media host that does things via crowdfunding. You know, there might have been one in the past, and I actually don't know if there was or wasn't. So, listener, if you do know of one, let us know. But we're going to get one, regardless of whether there's been one or not. So, Mark from Podiant sent out an email to different people, and yeah, I'm just going to read this. I know you're busy, so I only have 2 things to bring to you. Podiant is a tiny operation, and while we're in it for the long haul, we don't have huge amounts of funding behind us. So we've launched a Patreon page. We're considering a switch from our in-house payment system to Patreon, but regardless, it's still a great way to support Podiant. If you'd like to know more and pledge your support from as little as $1, visit patreon.com/Podiant, where you'll also find a personal video message from me. If we can reach our first milestone, it means I can spend more time making Podiant the amazing community I know it can be. Secondly, I've started a podcast which goes into detail about some of the features I'm adding and the challenges the platform has faced. You can check it out at platform.podiant.co. Thanks so much for being a part of Podiant's story. If you want to get in touch, you can find me on Twitter at PodiantHQ. Let's get to that $1,000 goal. Take care, Mark.
All right, so before we analyze this, let me just go ahead and tell you all, put away your keyboards right now. Stop your messages towards Stargate Pioneer. We know that it's pronounced Podiant, but SP and I both have always read it as Podiant in our heads, and just discovered from this video message that it's actually pronounced Podiant. So, potato, apparently, although it's a company name, so apparently you should only have one. But yeah, it is technically Podiant, but if you say Podiant, we accept you as well. Now, if you do go to this Patreon, which is patreon.com/Podiant, Podiant, you will see a video that is in there from Mark. Now, we're not going to play it now because, number one, it could get blocked on YouTube. Number two, we don't want to make you sit through there. But there's a few interesting quotes in this plea. I found when I watched this video that there is a lot of vagueness. Now, they say that they don't want to spill too many beans, but that's a pretty vague term as far as what the future holds of Podiant. Here's a quote right here. It is, "There are so many exciting things to come with Podiant." Another quote is, "So many new things that are going to get built, and I can't wait to bring those to you." To me, that indicates that those aren't even started yet. Another quote from the video is, "In order to get to the next level, I absolutely need your support." Now, when we compare that and we contrast that to the frequently asked questions on Podiant at podiant.co/FAQ, it says, "Podiant is a long-term plan with an aim at self-sustainability, but if those plans change, you won't be left in the dark." Those 2 points really contrast, which shows to me that this is definitely the essentially the sum of what we often see with new emerging media hosts. Just a lot of unknown, a lot of vagueness, a lot of good feelings, but conflicting information and questionability about the future. There's another quote that I wanted to mention as well, and it was, "There's some massive ones in the pipeline that I really want to get going on." And that's one of the last quotes in the video. And that to me just solidifies the fact that Mark, I believe, who must be behind it, just can't do this with the sort of income that he's getting now. Now, the question you have to ask yourself if you're using Podiant is, he's said in these quotes that he needs the support. Now, is it a misworded or a poorly worded message? Maybe yes, maybe no, but there's several quotes in there that says that these features aren't going to happen until we bring more revenue in. So, is that a great business plan for a company? In my opinion, not so much. If you are relying on crowdsourcing, I wouldn't want my RSS feed over there, or at least I would be questioning it, because they have said right there that they need the support to continue, essentially. Now, that's slight paraphrasing, but go watch the video. That's the message I got. Now, I actually wanted to play around with Podiant out of some testing. I'm lucky I'm technically savvy that I could make some casual swaps in and out of the GonnaGeek.com show, and I've done it before where it's been virtually unnoticed to the consumer. But I wanted to do this with Podiant and just sneakily bring in some files. But I went, and I have to say, the free version super confusing in my opinion as somebody coming in, because the help is mostly reserved for the paid version. I also interestingly noticed that when I uploaded 128 kilobit per second MP3, if you want to ask me why I use that, I will gladly talk to you about that, it downsampled it. So that was really weird to me. The other thing as well is that you get your landing page like you see on so many other media hosts. I couldn't find a way to shut that off. Now, that's not to say either of those features can go away, but as somebody who was evaluating it or trying to evaluate it from a perspective of someone who might be cheap, that was the mission of how I wanted to evaluate Podiant, because that's one of their big pushes there. I was confused. The help was not there and I couldn't find the answers. In fact, I tweeted them and they didn't respond. So I have issues recommending Podiant, and this just puts question marks in my mind further. So
the fact that they change your file is probably alone cause for me not to use them. But if they're not going to offer any sort of support or even a response of it's nice to hear from you, you might want to upgrade your service so we can give you support, that sort of thing, that would be cool. And it's hard for me to recommend this. Now, I've seen this recommended in different forums, Reddit, for example, people looking for cheap podcast hosting. If they're going to do crowdsourcing, I don't know. I'd have to wait 6 months before I'd be able to say, hey, look, it looks like they're going to make it. And I'd recommend trying to do it because this is a good business model. But just today, there's so much uncertainty. I mean, we've said no to SoundCloud, and they actually have some capital to use for the next year or so. I would not, if these guys don't have, if Mark doesn't have any capital to run, I'd be very, unless I was trying to do a podcast completely on the cheap and had nowhere else to go, I don't know if I would consider this. So, Mark, I wish you a lot of luck. I really do, because we do like to see competition in the podcast media host industry. But I don't know. This seems like it's a little bit risky.
Yeah. And I also, from a consumer perspective who does understand some of the challenges in the history with podcast media hosting. Remember, I've been podcasting since 2008, and I've seen these companies come in and out. The Patreon sends the wrong message. And it really gives uncertainty, and it just, especially using words like need. So I hope it was just poorly crafted, and maybe we'll get a follow-up and they'll be like, no. I'm sorry. This was misunderstood. This is what I mean. In order to do X, Y, and Z, I need more funding because X, Y, and Z is going to cost us sort of money, but we can keep doing A, B, and C on their own. So I kind of hope that might be the case, but at the moment, it's just another thing stopping me from suggesting people check out Podiant. Or Podiant, if you want, because we all love the word pod. Speaking of pod, let's go into Better Podback. Oh, Better Podback, my favorite pod section of them all. I love me some Better Podback, because this is where we find out about your pod happenings.
There was a tweet on September 4th from the @BetterPod account that said, what is your motivation for #podcasting? #podcast, #podcaster. Ryle Davis Jr. @RDavisJr12078 responded and said, it's a Sunday night most if you are a #hobby podcaster or getting ready to start your #hobby podcast, then @BetterPod is a must listen. Thank you very much, Ryle. We really appreciate the kind words.
We do indeed. And we also had Heather Welsh respond, and she said, to help rebuild my confidence in speaking, talk about stuff I'm passionate about, and make new connections within the podcast community.
Diami Plotke responded, and he said, coming up on a week since the last episode motivates me. Yeah, so you get that little urge to get your pod fix getting in there. Yeah, Dammy, well, I don't really get that because I don't think I've gone that long without podcasting, like ever, but okay. Yeah, I could see that happening.
We also had Christopher Nessie say, I podcast to educate, inform, and help educators. Who educates the educators? Oh,
he does. And that's @Mr. Nessie on pod, spelled NESI. And @Damien the DM. responded and said, after a couple of weeks of hearing it, I do miss listening to you guys stumble over the name of the podcast. Once again, that is Aurelia Pod. Stephen, say it with me.
Aurelia Pod.
Aurelia Pod. There you go. And he continued and said, my motivation is to get my group's story out to the world. Also, my motivation is to make use of all the money I spent on the setup. Yeah, it's great. You spend all this money, you might as well use the stuff. That is awesome. Now, we also got a tweet reply from at HDTA_Welsh. That's Heather Welsh. And she said, I want to help inspire and empower people too. Haha. Otherwise, that sounds a bit selfish when I didn't mean it to be.
You know what? Let's be honest. Better podcasting is pretty much the epitome of sounding selfish when we're not meaning to be selfish. We do that all the time.
Indeed, we do. At Bandrew Says replied, and he said, I have little free time to stay up to date with tech news, and podcasting makes me set aside time to read up on the week's news. Yeah, that's kind of why I do Long Box Edition, Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D., Starling Chip, Gonna Geek. Yeah, that's pretty much why I do all my podcasts. I get to actually stay up to date on those topics.
You know, speaking of finding news, one of the best ways in a modern world to find news is to use the Amazon Alexa briefings. Absolutely fantastic service. So make sure that you've got one of those if you don't have one of those.
I sense a little poking going on there at Bandrew, who has his Amazon Echo Dot in his shoe, in his closet, I believe. All right. So that was the feedback that we had for the week. We did have some wonderful people in the live chat room today. And Mike Howard said, I want to be doing my podcast from a lake home. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, that's here's the thing with that. Not all of us have lake homes. And so we've decided that those of us who want a lake home and one day want to podcast from a lake home, we're going to go ahead and steal those that have lake homes, properties and identities. That's what's going to happen there.
You can try to pry it from my cold, dead hands, sir.
We also had in the chat from the one and only Scott Smith. He said, where will I be 5 years from now? Celebrating the 5-year anniversary of this question. Ha-ha! We had Bandrew say in the chat as well, have you noticed that going to a convention has been worth it financially? Or do you think that if you are going to a convention because it's fun, it's a perfect time to submit a panel? So that's an interesting question, and one that we will have SP answer in a minute after I also thank Emily for saying, yes, take vacations when you need to. I needed my little break during my son's sleep regression because none of us were getting any sleep. So lots of good chat happening at Geeks.live, including that wonderful question from Bandrew about panels. Now, we have spoke about going to podcast I'm trying to not conventions. Thank you. I was trying not to say the one. And we are of the opinion that they are overrated for a hobby podcaster. If you want to check that out, we do have an episode number for you. It is episode number
80. You can get it at betterpodcasting.com/80. And it was titled Podcast Conventions Are Overrated for Hobbyists. Yeah, I did actually stay abreast of the news of the latest major podcast convention, and there didn't seem to be anything as a hobby podcaster that I would get out of that. I haven't heard anybody convince me of anything other than they meet other people in the space. They're friends that are in the space. Maybe they make a business connection or two. If you're a hobbyist and you don't care about making money, okay, I can see my friends, but I could travel and see them in person, or I could see them at another event, or just a lot of other things. For a hobbyist, paying $2,000 to go to a major podcast convention is a little bit daunting. And if you do have $2,000, I would encourage you as a hobby podcaster to spend that elsewhere. So is it financially worth it to go to a convention like Gen Con or C2E? Financially, no, but it was fun going there, and we got to lay out some great podcast knowledge at all those conventions, and we got to help a lot of great people out, which is great. So Is there any financial backing for me to do that? No. These are events that I would go to on my own. So I'm not going around the world going to all these podcast panels. I'm going to where I can feasibly go underneath my budget. So do I think that if I'm going to a convention because it's fun, that it's perfect time to submit a panel? Absolutely. If you have something to say, go ahead and submit for a panel. I will tell you that you will not all the time be accepted, but those podcasts or those conventions that you go to that you do get accepted, you get to learn, you get to have a great time, and you get to move on to bigger and better things later. So yeah, it's all worth it, but everything comes with a price, and experience is the price to pay for bigger and bigger panels. So I don't do panels for the fame. I do panels literally for the same reason we do better podcasting, and that is to get this information out to other people that want to improve their shows and make their shows better. Because honestly, the support that hobby podcasters get out there is nil because there's no money in it. So yeah, you take what you get from Better Pod, and we appreciate you listening to the show.
Yeah, and I will say that one of the things I'm always skeptical about backing up to things like Podcast Movement and other podcast conventions is that we really end up having to, as a community, essentially filter through a lot of the post-convention glow, in my opinion, because after a major podcast event like Podcast Movement, there is so much just afterglow going on, and a lot of people talking about the same highlights and everything. And to really assess whether or not it's worth it to you as a podcaster, a hobby podcaster, you should distance yourself a little bit, because we've all been to a fun party and we're like, oh yeah, this is the best party ever, this was fantastic, and then 2 weeks later you're like, wait, why did I spend $200 on renting a llama? And you just in that situation. So it's the same thing with
do.
This is what you do. So really, you got to remember that glow is going on right now as we record this on September 6th. And so some of the information coming out, you may want to just wait a little bit before you decide if you're going to invest in next year's. My personal opinion of it, I have not been to Podcast Movement. I'm not saying I'll never go, because I would go to other conventions, and podcasting is fun for me. So if I had the right circumstances where, I had the money to go and I wanted to just enjoy the love of podcasting, maybe I would consider going in the same sense that I would go to something like a comic convention, because I am a geek. I would like to go to a comic convention that would be just fun just to hang out and check out the sites. But when I look at the money and what I would like to spend it on, I would rather go to a convention in my niche than spend the money on going to a podcast convention where I'm surrounded by a bunch of other podcasters, because I'm not looking to build my business or anything like that. So it's the same idea, in my opinion, as going and trying to promote your podcast within a podcast group on Facebook or on Reddit. These are all fellow podcasters. They're not your target audience. So your target audience is people who are within your genre. If you are a woodworking podcast, you're going to end up going to some woodworking conventions. Or if you are somebody who is all about ways that you can rent out your llama to partygoers, you're going to go to a llama convention.
Yeah, what's with the llamas? Did you rent a llama recently? Is there some sort of personal decision in your life that you made that you're regretting right now?
Maybe.
With all that said, our advice is dedicated towards hobby podcasters. So if you are trying to make money podcasting, or you're already making money podcasting, then a podcast convention like Podcast Movement, like Podfest, is probably for you to try to make those conventions, maybe get connections, maybe even with advertisers. So yeah, I get all that, but for a hobby podcaster with under 500 downloads per episode, it's not the right place for you. At least that's my opinion. If you can convince me otherwise, please, I am open to the discussion, but I haven't seen anything that tells me otherwise at this point.
The only thing that really, really intrigues me about the future of podcast conventions is there's more and more gear, from my understanding, again, never been, but gear being demoed and stuff. And as a big gearhead, which is not actually the way you usually use the term gearhead, I absolutely am intrigued in that side of things. But I also, is it enough to make me spend $2,000? No, because I could spend $2,000 on gear. So there you go.
Indeed.
Well, I by the way, I can't spend $2,000 on gear, but if I was going to spend $2,000 on a convention, I could spend it on gear instead. That was my point, because I can't afford even to bring in Zoom H6 with me on the road.
Yeah, he's pretty bare bones there, folks. And Bandrew, we hope this answered your question. And if anybody else had the question out there that have been hearing a lot about podcast movement and a lot about the great stuff that's happened there, then we hope that this has helped you try to make a more informed decision for 2018.
Awesome. Well, that is going to take us towards the end of the show. Now, before we do wrap up, we'll remind you we're part of the Gonna Geek Network, and also on the Gonna Geek Network is a fantastic show that you may have heard of called Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. This is the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe podcast of the Gonna Geek Network. It is hosted by two wonderful ladies and one mediocre guy named Stargate Pioneer. You can check that out at legendsofshield.com, which forwards over to the Gonna Geek Network-ish.
It does.
Now, on that note, I want to say a wise quote, the wisest quote that I have ever heard in all of the world of podcasting. This comes from the wonderful, wonderful person named Bandrew, and it is, life is dynamic, like the microphone you should be using for your podcast. There you go. So, for episode 96 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen Jondrew saying, Bandrew, you're a smart man.
And I'm Stargate Pioneer saying, where are you going to be in 5 years? I hope to see you there. Catch you guys later. Bye.
SP, your kids. Something's got to be done about them.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.